Okay, it's our final video. Reconstruction of the United States. The battle begins. Union troops and cannons had devastated most of southern cities, and the South's economy was devastated. President and Congress had to deal with Reconstruction, or basically the rebuilding of the South after the Civil War. They also had to decide under what terms and conditions the former Confederate states would rejoin the Union. President Lincoln's proclamation of amnesty and Reconstruction called for a general amnesty, or pardon, to all Southerners who took an oath of loyalty to the United States and accepted the Union's proclamations concerning slavery. After 10% of the state's voters in the 1860 presidential election had taken the oath, the state could organize a new government. Radical Republicans in Congress, led by Representative Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania and Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, did not want to reconcile with the South. They had three main goals. They wanted to prevent the Confederate leaders from returning to power after war. They wanted the Republican Party to become powerful in the South. And they wanted the federal government to help African Americans achieve political equality by guaranteeing them the right to vote in the South. Modern Republicans thought Lincoln's plan was too lenient on the South, and the radical Republicans' plan was too harsh. By the summer of 1864, the moderates and the radicals came up with a plan that both could support. The Wade-Davis bill was introduced in Congress and passed. The Wade-Davis bill required the majority of adult white men in a former Confederate state to take an oath of allegiance to the Union. The state could then hold a constitutional convention to create a new state government. Each state's convention would then have to abolish slavery, repudiate all debts the state had acquired as part of the Confederacy, and deprive any former Confederate government officials and military officers the right to vote or hold office. Lincoln thought the plan was too harsh, so he blocked the bill with a pocket veto. He did this by letting the session of Congress expire without signing the bill. The Freedmen's Bureau. Thousands of freed African Americans, known as freedmen, had followed General Sherman and his troops as they marched through Georgia and South Carolina. As a result of the refugee crisis, Congress established the Freedmen's Bureau. This bureau was to feed and clothe war refugees in the South using Army surplus supplies. They also tried to help freedmen find work and negotiate pay and hours worked on plantations. Now, the Freedmen's Bureau's lasting contribution was in education, though. It provided schools, paid teachers, and helped establish colleges for training African American teachers. Many freed African Americans served in the U.S. Cavalry after 1866. Those stationed in the southwestern United States became known as the Buffalo Soldiers. Okay, so after Lincoln's assassination, Vice President Andrew Johnson became president. Johnson agreed with Lincoln that a moderate policy was needed to bring the South back to the Union. So in May of 1865, Andrew Johnson issued a new proclamation of amnesty. This plan offered to pardon all former citizens of the Confederacy, took an oath of loyalty to the Union, and to return their property. Excluded from the plan were all former Confederate officers and officials. These people could have individually asked the president for a pardon. Johnson's plan to restore the South to the Union included having each former Confederate state ratify the 13th Amendment and abolishing slavery. The Southern states, for the most part, met Johnson's conditions. Johnson granted pardons to thousands of Southerners. Many members of Congress were angry that several former Confederate officers and political leaders were elected to Congress. Radical and moderate Republicans voted to reject these new members of Congress. As a result, now, the new Southern state legislatures passed laws known as black codes that severely limited African Americans' rights in the South. The codes varied from state to state, but in general they were written with the intention of keeping African Americans in conditions similar to slavery. The black codes enraged many of the Northerners as a result of those codes being passed. All right. Congressional Reconstruction. In late 1865, the House and Senate Republicans created a joint committee on Reconstruction to develop their own program for the Union. In March 1866, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866. The act gave citizenship to all persons born in the United States except Native Americans. It guaranteed the rights of African Americans to own property and be treated equally in court. It granted the U.S. government the right to sue people who violated these rights. The 14th Amendment also granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States. It said that no state could deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. No state could deny any person equal protection of these laws. Congress passed the amendment in June of 1866. It was sent to the states for ratification then. The 14th Amendment became the major issue in the congressional election of 1866. Johnson was against the amendment. He wanted Northern voters to elect a new majority in Congress that would support his plan for Reconstruction. Increased violence against African Americans and their supporters erupted in the South due to some of this stuff going on. The Republicans won a 3-1 majority in Congress. So in March of 1867, Congress passed the Military Reconstruction Act. This act did away with Johnson's Reconstruction programs, and the act divided the former Confederate states, except Tennessee because it had ratified the 14th Amendment, into 5 military districts. A Union general was placed in charge of each district. Each former Confederate state had to hold another constitutional convention to write a constitution that Congress would accept. The Constitution had to give the right to vote to all adult male citizens, and after the state ratified its new Constitution, it had to ratify the 14th Amendment. Then the state could elect people to Congress. Republicans feared that Johnson would veto their Reconstruction plan and interfere with their plans by refusing to enforce the Military Reconstruction Act. So, Congress passed the Command of the Army Act that required all orders from the President to go through the headquarters of the General of the Army. Congress passed the Tenure of Office Act also that required the Senate to approve the removal of any government official whose appointment had required the Senate's approval. On February 21, 1868, Johnson challenged the Tenure of Office Act by firing Secretary of War Edward M. Stanton. Stanton supported the Congressional Reconstruction Plan. After Johnson fired Stanton, the House of Representatives voted to impeach Johnson. So they charged Johnson with breaking the law by refusing to uphold the Tenure of Office Act and with trying to undermine the Reconstruction program. After more than 2 months of debate, the Senate vote was 1 vote short for conviction. The impeachment took away what little power Johnson had left. He did not run for election in 1868, and General Ulysses S. Grant was a Republican candidate. The presence of Union soldiers in the South helped African Americans vote in large numbers. Grant easily won the election, and Republicans kept majorities in both houses of Congress. The Republican-led Congress also then proposed the 15th Amendment to the Constitution. This amendment said that the right to vote could not be denied on account of race, color, or previous servitude. The amendment became part of the Constitution in 1870. Okay, so Republican rule in the South. By 1870, all former Confederate states had rejoined the Union. During Reconstruction, many Northerners moved to the South. Many were elected or appointed positions in the state governments. These Southerners referred to these Northerners as carpetbaggers because some brought suitcases made of carpet fabric. Many Southerners viewed the Northerners as intruders who wanted to gain from the South's post-war troubles. Southerners also disliked scallywags, white Southerners who worked with the Republicans and supported Reconstruction. Thousands of formerly enslaved people took part in governing the South. They were delegates to state conventions, local officials, and state and federal legislatures. Hiram Revels became the first African American in the United States Senate during this time period. The Republican Party became powerful in the South and started many major reforms. The reforms included repealing the black codes, establishing state hospitals, rebuilding roads and railways damaged during the Civil War. And to pay for Republican reforms, many Southern state governments borrowed money and imposed high property taxes. Some Republicans in the South became corrupt during this time and were accused of graft or getting money illegally through politics, and this became common in the South during this time period. Many formerly enslaved African Americans attended schools in the South during Reconstruction, and by 1876, about 40% of all African American children attended school in the region. African Americans in the South, they established their own churches, which served as centers of many African American communities. So many Southern whites resented African Americans and the black Republican government. Some Southerners organized secret societies such as the KKK to undermine the Republican rule. Klan members terrorized supporters of the Republican governments, including African Americans, white Republicans, carpetbaggers, teachers in African American schools, and others who supported the Republican governments and equality for African Americans. In 1870 and 71, Congress passed 3 enforcement acts to end the violence in the South, one of which made the activities of the KKK illegal. Ulysses S. Grant had little political experience, and he was a drunk. He believed that his only role as president was to carry out the laws. So he let Congress develop policy. This left the president weak and ineffective, and it helped divide the Republican Party and undermine the public support for Reconstruction. Democrats attacked the Republican economic policies, saying that the policies benefited wealthy Americans at the expense of the poor. Liberal Republicans agreed with the Democrats and left the Republican Party in 1872. Liberal Republicans and the Democratic Party nominated the influential newspaper publisher Horace Greeley for president. Grant, the Republican candidate, wins the election of 1872. Now, in his second term, he was hurt by a lot of series of scandals. Grant's Secretary of War, William Belknap, accepted bribes from merchants operating Western Army outposts. And in 1875, the whiskey ring scandal involved a group of government officials, possibly including Grant's private secretary and distillers in St. Louis, who cheated the government by filing false tax reports. The Panic of 1873 caused many smaller banks to close and the stock market to fall. Thousands of businesses closed and tens of thousands of Americans became unemployed as a result. Now, in 1874, Democrats won control of the House of Representatives and gained seats in the Senate. Okay, so during the 1870s, Democrats worked to regain control of state and local governments from the Republicans. Southern Democrats defined the elections as a struggle between whites and African Americans. By 1876, Democrats had control of most southern state legislatures. The Republican candidates in the election of 1876 was Rutherford B. Hayes. Hayes wanted to end radical Reconstruction. The Democratic candidate was Samuel Tilden, the former governor of New York. Neither candidate won a majority of the electoral votes. There was so much election fraud that it was hard to tell who had won. So Congress worked out the Compromise of 1877 in which Hayes became president. It is believed that to get Southern Democrats in Congress to agree to Hayes as president, the compromise included the promise by Republicans to pull federal troops out of the South. Hayes pulled the federal troops out of the South. This ended Republican governments and Reconstruction in the South. A new South arises. President Hayes wanted to put an end to the nation's regional differences. Many Southerners wanted a new South with a strong industrial economy. An alliance between Southerners and Northern financiers brought great economic change to parts of the South. Capital from Northerners built railroads and dozens of new industries. And many parts of the South still based their economies on agriculture at this time. Most African Americans had little political power and worked under difficult and unfair conditions in this new South. And after Reconstruction ended, African Americans returned to plantations owned by whites where they worked for wages or became tenant farmers, paying rent for the land they farmed. Most tenant farmers ended up becoming sharecroppers. They paid a share of their crops to cover their rent and farming costs. Although sharecropping allowed African American farmers to control their own work schedule and working conditions, it also trapped them in poverty because they could not make enough money to pay off their debts and buy their own land. And that concludes our discussion here on the Civil War. I know this was a long video, but that was a big section, and you had a lot to go through. Now you have to get ready for your common assessments. As always, be ready for a quiz on this information. Thank you, and have a good day.